when a Miami construction crew cracked open an abandoned warehouse. They thought they'd just found old debris. But inside was a sealed glass cube plastered wall to wall with black and white photographs of a missing woman. Her eyes stared out from every angle, her hands pressed against the glass, her own handwriting smeared across the prints. Still here. This wasn't art. This was captivity. And it proved the truth no one wanted to face. Annabella Phillips didn't vanish in 2005. She was kept. Before we dive deeper, hit subscribe for more vanished and chilling mysteries. She vanished on a humidity-soaked August night in 2005, the kind of night Miami remembers for weeks. Neon sweating into gutters, cicadas rasping like static, the city's heat sticking to everything it touched. Annabella Phillips had been small in the doorway of her Coconut Grove apartment, one bare foot on the step, the other missing its shoe. A single trail of wet footprints led from her threshold to the street and ended at the mouth of a cul-de-sac, where the night swallowed them whole. By morning, the missing person posters were stapled to telephone poles, and the coffee shops replayed the rumor like a vinyl record skipping. She'd run. She'd been picked up by a man in a silver sedan. She'd been taken. Family and friends painted her in soft, defiant colors, the kind people use to make grief palatable. The police docket filled with statements and theories. The case closed in the cold way a file gets stamped. Inactive, unsolved, a ghost to be visited in other investigators' nightmares. Mateo Vargas never stopped visiting. He had been a detective then, young and raw, assigned to the night shift and handed the paperwork because someone had to follow up on the footprints. He had looked at Annabella's life like one examines an art piece through a magnifying glass. Edges, obscured signatures, fingerprints no one else seemed bothered to find. She was 27, a freelance photographer who shot Miami in grain and shadow. Her brother called her stubborn. Her landlady called her tidy. Her profile on a now ancient site had her smiling by an Everglades boardwalk. Mateo filed the interviews and the prints and the dash cams that showed a silver sedan idling for 3 minutes at the end of the cul-de-sac before driving off. The plates were clipped, the driver untraced. In the months that followed, police followed the route the sedan often took, past the docks, past a shuttered pool hall, past a gallery that radiated warmth under its white lights. The gallery had a name then, Hale and Son, and a proprietor as charismatic as toothpaste adverts. Ezra Hale, a sculptor with an easy smile and the kind of hair that photographers pay to retouch. He was the man with donations to the art museum, the man who married the right people, the man who posed with dogs and children, who sold chalk as a commodity, liquid plaster that looked like bone. Ezra's work celebrated captivity in clean, geometric forms. He called his themes confinement and beauty, and critics called him visionary. Mateo noticed Ezra because a Polaroid developed from Annabella's camera, the only one that had survived the night, had a tiny rectangle of something pasted to the corner, a sliver of plaster, cream and rough, as if someone had pressed a broken sculpture into the photograph like a thumbprint. Mateo filed it, like everything else. The file thickened with small, useless things. An unanswered voicemail, the rent check Annabella had paid, a bus ticket stub to Key West with a hole punched in it, a receipt from a gallery where she had sold a piece just weeks before she disappeared. Then life happened. Mateo's partner moved away, the department reshuffled. Cases stacked in boxes along the periphery of the precinct. The truth retreated under a stack of other urgent things. He left the force a year later, with his professional disillusion packed neatly into his car. But he kept the Polaroid. 16 years are long for evidence and short for memory. When he opened the old file in the late autumn of 2021, it had the smell of old coffee and something else, paper slowly turning to brittle. Mateo was older then. His face cut by lines the city had been generous enough to draw for him. He ran a small investigative blog that paid in attention rather than money. He'd found he could pry things open without the bureaucracy of a badge. He had saved Annabella's Polaroid behind a false book spine on his shelf, and when he slid it out now, he realized he had been looking at it wrong. The plaster sliver at the Polaroid's edge wasn't random. It carried a faint smear, tiny ridges that mapped like fingerprints. To a layman, it was debris. To Mateo, it was a pattern. He photographed it and enhanced it on his battered laptop, He adjusted contrasts, highlighted shadows, ran what used to be called a negative scan, then posted the image to a forum where old case enthusiasts traded leads like baseball cards. The crowd on the forum did what forums do. They argued, they created theories, and they found things. Someone recognized a mark in the plaster, an artist's signature in code. Someone else found a grain of sand lodged in a hairline crack that matched the silica in the dredge deposits near the port of Miami. Then, in a thread, a username that belonged to an art student in New Orleans wrote a single line. That texture. Hale uses a mix with horsehair. It's his style. Ezra Hale's gallery had closed years ago after a scandal about a performance piece that went too far. Someone fainted, someone sued. But his clients were still everywhere. Gallery owners, museum trustees, donors. Matteo called the museum's archivist under a pretense and got a list of Halley's shows in the early 2000s. Annabella had photographed one of them. She had taken a close shot of a stage dressing, a glass box with a woman inside that, the paper said, breathed like a living thing. Matteo pushed the file across his kitchen table at night while his son slept and something in him settled like a stone. He bought a coffee with 2 sugars and drove to the address on Ezra's current business license. Ezra's building was a converted warehouse near the river, a facade of weathered bricks, windows like black eyes. He greeted Matteo at the door with a practiced warmth and a gift wrapped in tissue, an invitation to his new exhibit. He was talking about the vulnerability of exposure when Matteo asked without preamble, "Where were you the night Annabella Phillips disappeared?" Ezra's smile contracted, and for a moment there was something animal in the way he watched Matteo. "I remember the night," he said. "I remember the city was softer because of the rain. But Annabella, what are you doing asking me this now?" Matteo tried him with the plaster, with the Polaroid, with the names of people who'd seen her at Ezra's opening months before she vanished. Ezra listened like a man cataloging the pages of an old, unread narrative. "Annabella was a bright photographer," he said finally. "She liked to find the rawness in people. We spoke for a while. She admired confining spaces. I admired her eye. But admire is not the same as owning." "Did anyone ever tell you they wanted to keep someone?" Matteo asked. The question struck like a cold wind. Ezra stepped back, then offered Matteo a glass of water, which he took because manners are the last refuge of a professional. "Who told you that?" he asked. His voice was even like a scale. "No one should keep anyone. It's a grotesque phrase." Matteo left with an invitation he didn't accept. Ezra's answer sat like a stone. 2 days later, Matteo watched footage from a security camera near the gallery. A woman in a long white dress, Annabella, had been filmed leaving the gallery the night she vanished. She walked across the parking lot, head down, then paused as if to tie a shoe. The silver sedan was there, its lights on. A man with Ezra's height and build leaned from the passenger window. Annabella spoke for a long second, then climbed in. Matteo felt the room tilt. Nothing about that footage explained the shoe in the doorway or the footprints that ended in the street. But it explained the gullibility of juries and the slipperiness of truth. People make choices in the long shadows and sometimes choose the wrong light to walk toward. He pushed further, the way water pushes through concrete, patiently finding gaps. He tracked Ezra's purchases, his travel, his donors. He found a pattern of patrons who worked as contractors for private housing conversions. Warehouses, pool houses, subterranean basements, the kind of projects that required discretion. He found receipts for plywood, for a glass installer who did unmarked jobs, for horsehair and a rare adhesive used in sculpture. Each paper was a stitch in a dark tapestry. A breakthrough came when Lena, Annabella's younger sister, slid into Matteo's kitchen like a paper boat. She had the same sharp mouth and the same eyes that measured people for their honesty and found them wanting. She had been 21 when Annabella vanished. She was 38 now and had not forgiven the world for being indifferent to her sister's disappearance. "I found this," she said, and put a thin cardboard folder on the table. Inside was a stack of printed emails, Annabella's drafts for a show, all of them poetic and odd. One line repeated itself like an ember. "I will show them what it means to be kept." There were also pictures of a model, one shot of a woman in a glass cube with condensation on the surface. Annabella had annotated the margins. Breathe, look, do not panic. Mateo's hands shook. She was going to expose something, Lena said. She was going to make them uncomfortable. She found something she wanted to show. They began to piece together a map of where art and secrecy braided. Ezra's installations were more than shows. They were private performances for the rich. Exclusive nights where donors watched from behind velvet ropes. Annabella had photographed one such private performance 3 weeks before she vanished. The guest list included a shipping magnate, a philanthropist who chaired a hospital wing, and a man who owned several boutique hotels. The more Mateo dug, the more he found that the men who loved Ezra's work prized control. The control of a subject, of a narrative, of a woman silent in a thing made visible. It was Lena who noticed a small, dull mark on the edge of one of Annabella's prints she'd kept in a shoebox. A fingerprint, smudged. Mateo ran it through the database, and against his disappointment, against a pall of 16 years, got a match. The print belonged to a man named Derek Malikov, a security contractor who worked private events across South Florida. He had been on the guest list the night Annabella photographed the performance. He had been seen by witnesses as someone who lingered near the stage. He also had keys to a storage facility not far from a river where Ezra kept his larger installations between shows. Mateo and Lena went to Derek's listed address and found a house that tried to be modest and failed. It was the sort of place that told stories of invisible wages, plastic on furniture, mismatched curtains, a small Honda that smelled like fast food. Derek answered the door with a dog on a leash and a face that would not stay still. He denied knowing Annabella. He doubled down until his voice frayed, then became small as a child. "You don't have to make up stories," he said finally. But his hands betrayed him, calloused, paint under the nails, a scar that ran up to the wrist like a lace seam. When Mateo showed him a photograph, Derek's hand trembled in a way that had nothing to do with age. He admitted to delivering crates to a river warehouse on the nights of private events, then to driving a silver sedan within the same year Annabella vanished. He explained that he'd moved on, that he'd seen a woman, he couldn't be sure, get into a sedan near Ezra's gallery. "She looked like she wanted to leave," he said. "But sometimes people get into cars by choice." Inside Derek's garage, behind a stack of birdseed and bicycle spare parts, Mateo found a crate that smelled like wet plaster and something sweet and metallic. There was a fragment of fabric lodged in the corner, and when Mateo unfolded it, he thought for a moment the world had become terribly small. It was the corner of Annabella's favorite scarf, the one Lazarus, her brother, had given her for her 27th birthday. Mateo's breath left him on a quiet exhale. Derek squirmed. "I don't know where they took her," he said. "I was drunk. I signed a log I wasn't supposed to sign." The log Derek signed was a paper with dates, times, and names, Ezra's gallery, a storage unit number. Mateo used his old contacts to get a warrant. The search of Unit 214 was like pushing open a curtain into a private theater. Inside, crates of plaster, a kiln, boxes of hair, a glass cube that had been made smaller and smaller until it could be carried by 2 people. Under a tarp, wrapped in a canvas, so that no light should find it, Mateo found the remnants of a life that had been folded into art. A camera with its film missing, a Polaroid that had been torn in half, and a notebook with Annabella's handwriting scrawled across the pages. The handwriting was not desperate, it was precise. The notebook was a map of someone who had thought, as artists do, that there is power in arranging what you cannot control. She had listed names she'd observed at the private performances, phone numbers scribbled and crossed out. In the margins, a single line repeated until it became a mantra. "If they will have me as object, I will make them sit with themselves." Mateo read until his eyes burned. They detained Derek and brought in Ezra for questioning. Ezra said he hadn't meant for things to go this far. He spoke of art, of the body as a site of history, of consent rehearsed in private rooms. He admitted to renting storage units for props, and to a strict policy that all performances be recorded, and the records kept only for patrons. He claimed ignorance about an object becoming a prison. The police watched him with faces like flat masks. The story took the shape of confession when Derek, sweating under the interrogation lamp, began to speak in a creak of words. He had driven Annabella to Unit 214 the night she vanished, he said, because Ezra had asked him to move a piece that had gone wrong. Annabella had been curious. She wanted to photograph the unsold work. She had been stubborn in the way that makes other people's mediocre plans collapse. They argued. Derek's voice stuttered as he said it. She had slipped. She had struck her head on a crate. And Annabella hadn't woken up. It was a thing that happens in small moments to people who think themselves beyond messiness. An accident, a panicked decision to conceal, a belief that paper could be smoothed over. Derek's account was the sort of thing fiction makes tidy. An error that became a mausoleum. Ezra admitted to helping move the body into the crate and to sealing the storage unit, his hands a steady clock. He said they meant to bury it somewhere quiet, but the city does not allow quiet for long. He had planned to cremate it years later, when the heat of rumors cooled. Mateo stared at them both until his eyes hurt. The city offered him faces that could be believed. Families need culprits like a heart needs its valves. He arrested Ezra for conspiracy and Derek for manslaughter. The charges did not feel like the word that could hold the breach. A woman erased by men who treated other people like materials. The trial that followed was as theatrical as Ezra's installations, the courtroom a gallery of grief. There were apologies in place of amends. And when the verdict came, not everyone left satisfied. The press had called Annabella's disappearance the art world's worst side, an aestheticized neglect. But in a quiet room, Mateo clutched the notebook like a relic and listened to Lena weep into a shoulder. They dug deeper into the storage units, and though Annabella's body was never found, the court heard the fullness of what had become of her creative mind. Ezra's empire dissolved in the press, and the polite rooms where donors whispered. Patrons scrubbed their names from plaques, and work that once sold for sums that made people feel superior now hung in auction houses with tags that read controversial. It was not the resolution Mateo craved. There was no moment when a woman, dust-coated and blinking, stepped from behind a curtain and smiled like she'd only been gone for a Monday. There was only the slow unraveling of men who had believed they could place art and personhood in the same frame and call it grand. Years later, Mateo would think of the gaps, the missing footage, the places where evidence refused to sit still like a well-trained dog. He would think of the way Lydia, an art critic, sat in the trial and watched Ezra with a pair of lips that could not disguise a lack of surprise. He would think of how a city that praises spectacle also cultivates the people who profit from silence. But the case was not over in the ways that mattered. Months after the verdict, a small gallery in Little Havana, a cramped place with a fan that smelled of lime and rust, hung a new installation. It had no name on the wall. People who went inside said it was plain, a single glass cube, empty aside from a stack of photographs on a metal chair. The photos were Annabella's, prints she'd taken in the weeks before she vanished. Images of women with their faces tilted away, of hands pressed to fog glass, of breath that made shapes. Someone had placed them there like an altar. Lena went first. She traced the edges of a print with a finger that trembled, and then with one that steadied. She wanted them to look, she said. Mateo stood by the doorway and felt a wind that had nothing to do with the ceiling fan. The people in the gallery murmured about the ethics of exhibiting work tied to tragedy. He had no answer for them. Ethics, like art, lives in a frame chosen by someone with power. He only knew that the photographs, Annabella's voice hidden in silver and grain, finally had a place to be seen. The worst parts of truth do not come as cinematic confrontations. They arrive like a change in weather, a realization that things you thought were true were built on quicksand. The shock that women who are objectified can be erased, not because of a single monstrous plan, but because the gears of society allow it, because spectacle blinds people until it costs a life. On the night the gallery opened, Mateo found himself walking home alone on a street slick with a flat reflection of neon. He saw movement in a storefront window, a woman inside adjusting a photograph on an easel. For a moment his heart jumped so hard he thought it would break, an old reflex, a siren in the blood. But the woman was not Annabella. She was younger, hair cropped like victory, arranging her life where the light would be kind. Matteo had imagined the moment of discovery 1,000 times. He had imagined himself as a rescuer, a final act of good. The truth was that he had been part of a long, quiet rescue, of a memory, of a voice. Annabella was not resurrected in body. She lived in the hands that would not let her photographs be lost, in the women who lined up to look at the images and found themselves recognized. The rescue was less dramatic and more durable. On the edge of that realization, behind all the legal triumphs and the public outrage, lay a different kind of story that never made it to the headlines. It was a story about how we, habitually, without malice and sometimes with it, turn people into consumable things until someone else pays the price. It was a story about men who build empires on being seen and women who learn to make themselves visible in ways that are safer, or at least less exploitable. It was a story that asked whether art could be used to expose harm without becoming the harm itself. In the quiet months that followed the trial, Lena opened a small bench named for her sister. It was not a monument. It was a place for someone to rest in the park where Annabella had taken a picture of a child tossing a paper boat into the river. Matteo came sometimes and sat with a coffee that always tasted like rain. They did not speak of the trial unless they had to. They spoke instead of smaller things, a line in a photograph, a joke Annabella used to tell, the way she pronounced the word hullabaloo, as if it were a foreign city. Then one afternoon, Lena brought Matteo a manila envelope with one more thing in it. Inside was a Polaroid, untampered, whole, and on the back Annabella had written, in a hand Matteo now trusted like an old note, 2 words, "Keep looking." Matteo carried that Polaroid in a pocket of his jacket for a long time, like a prayer. It was not the sign that Annabella had been alive. It was a reminder that people who vanish do not disappear. They become different kinds of presences. Some sit in galleries. Some live in the small, protective radiance of a sister's eyes. Some make a command out of their last handwriting. Years after the conviction, Ezra Hale died in a hospital bed, his hands raw from a clay that would not mold itself into forgiveness. Derek Malikov served a sentence that let him out a man diminished by his apology. They had paid their legal debts in money and time, but the ledger that counts the cost of a life lost never balanced. Matteo still woke sometimes to the memory of that night in 2005, the shoe on the step, the foam of a tide of people who never looked enough. He was no longer a detective then. He was someone who kept records, who pulled threads from the world to see what they would reveal. He had learned that the most important work sometimes felt like cataloging grief until it fit into a frame that could be seen. He had learned to resist the urge for tidy endings. Annabella's photographs continued to be shown in small rooms, their grainy edges forgiving. Students pointed to them like proof that the world had been, for a moment, given back a portion of itself. People would see a woman breathing on glass and shiver, then look away, and then come back and look again. The shock of the case, when it came, was not in a revelation, but in a soft persistence. It was in the way a city that coveted spectacle tolerated the small violences until a person with a camera looked long enough to make the surface peel. It was in the stubbornness of a sister who would not let the world stop at missing, and in a detective who would not accept the softness of a past that had been folded and put away. Some nights Matteo walked past Ezra's old warehouse and watched the lights go out in order. He thought of the glass boxes that had once been art and wondered whether those who sat behind velvet ropes ever learned to see themselves for what they were, spectators to compromise, to cruelty dressed as taste. He hoped they did. He hoped more than that. He hoped that each photograph of Annabella would teach someone to look harder. And sometimes, very late, when the city seemed to be holding its breath, Matteo would take the Polaroid out of his pocket and thumb the plaster edge almost to feel the ridges Annabella had trusted would tell a story. He would put the picture back and walk on, because looking was not an ending. It was an act of maintenance, a promise that even if you could not bring someone back, you could keep them present enough that a city could no longer pretend it was not watching. Annabella had vanished, and in the end she did something that would have been impossible had she stayed. She made a world look at itself and find, somewhere inside, a mirror. It was not the resolution Mateo had imagined in the heat of youthful certainty. It was a harder thing, an insistence that when we hurt others in the name of beauty, we are the ones who become ugly. And that perhaps, if enough people continued to look, there would be fewer empty shoes on thresholds and more people who would not let a name be a ghost. In the spring of 2022, just when the case seemed sealed by verdicts and time, something surfaced that chilled Mateo more than any courtroom testimony. A construction crew demolishing an abandoned warehouse along the Miami River unearthed a sealed concrete chamber. Inside, beneath layers of plaster and rotting wood, was a glass cube. The workers thought it was debris from an old art installation. But when police arrived, they found what looked like a shrine. Dozens of black and white photographs plastered against the inside of the glass, all warped by humidity, all of the same woman. Annabella. Her eyes stared out from every angle, close-ups of her face, her hands, her profile half in shadow. Some photos were hers, taken from her own camera, but others had been taken of her, watching her, documenting her. The cube was empty. No remains, no body, only photographs that whispered a truth darker than Derek's accident story. The news spread quickly, a fresh wound torn open. Reporters asked whether Ezra and Derek had lied, whether Annabella had been kept alive inside that cube for days or weeks before being erased completely. The medical examiner could not confirm it, but the evidence suggested surveillance, a grotesque obsession far beyond an accident. Mateo stared at the photographs under sterile police light, his hands trembling. Annabella had written notes in the margins of some prints, words pressed against the glass with her own pen. Still here. They watch. Don't stop looking. It was not an accident. It had been captivity. Ezra's final denial unraveled in retrospect. He had framed it as performance, as metaphor, but the chamber showed something horrifying. Annabella's art had been stolen and twisted into her prison. She had been made into the very thing she was trying to expose. The revelation broke Lena. She screamed at the press conference, her voice ragged, accusing the world of applauding a monster, while her sister suffocated unseen. She demanded to know how many patrons had watched, how many had looked into that glass, and convinced themselves it was only performance. The answer never came. The state closed the site, but Mateo knew the truth would never close. He saw it in every cube-shaped shadow, in every gallery where art flirted with cruelty. Annabella had been silenced, yes, but she had left behind a message sharper than any verdict. Her final notes, scrawled on damp photographs, weren't just for her family. They were for anyone who ever looked away when cruelty was disguised as beauty. Don't stop looking. That line became the epigraph on the plaque beneath her photographs when they were finally displayed at Miami's Modern Art Museum. Crowds gathered, not for Ezra's grandeur, but for Annabella's last defiance. Her images stared back at them, accusing, refusing to fade. For Mateo, it was the final shock. She had turned her captivity into testimony. Even in silence, she had forced the world to see. And in that way, Annabella Phillips never vanished at all. She remained, forever watching, forever demanding, until no one could look away again. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on the notification bell, so you stay updated with mystery stories that strike a chord. Thanks for watching.